Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to briefly touch upon the ineffective way in which our government are functioning, particularly just in this emergency, and particularly with the breaking news last night, or at the very least, the dishonest way that it says it's functioning. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, this is actually the second version of this video because at the time I'd originally done it, the Prime Minister had unfortunately had to be admitted to hospital at the weekend. Dominic Raab, but one of the thickest people to have graced a British cabinet, was at the helm for Boris Johnson's absence. Now, during his press conference yesterday, however, Raab dropped the sort of clangor that he's well known for, but this time it's not really amusing. It's actually quite worrying. The fact is that a country needs a head of government at all times, much more so in a time of crisis. Even when it's one who has not been particularly effective, like Boris Johnson, you need that person in place. There has to be that person who has the authority to make those executive decisions, even when there are people better placed to decide on things. The Prime Minister has to give them the go-ahead. Yes, that's what we're going to do. In a rare show of foresight, I suppose, for this government, they did announce that Dominic Raab would deputise for Boris Johnson should anything happen to him. And they did that before Johnson tested positive, to be fair. But the narrative since Johnson's admission to hospital has been confusing, to say the least. So first of all, the government were insisting that Boris Johnson was still in charge, which was fine. As we were being told at the time, the Prime Minister was in hospital as a precaution. You know, his fever hadn't gone down after about a week, which would be a worrying enough sign. At the time, I was going, right, good stuff, let's hope that's true. I certainly genuinely would wish him a speedy recovery and a return to Downing Street. Very genuinely, because this is not anything to do with politics. A man has been struck down and that's all there is to it. But Dominic Raab, the person who was supposed to be operating the actual levers of power, taking his directions from Boris Johnson, fine, okay. Except that in Monday's press conference, Dominic Raab said that he'd last spoken to the Prime Minister on Saturday. So that means that this person who was supposed to be there to deputise hadn't spoken to the Prime Minister since before he was admitted to hospital, the day before he was admitted to hospital. So, in that sense, in what sense was Boris Johnson calling the shots? They can't set up an office around his hospital bed. He could only possibly be in contact with anyone via the phone. We knew that he'd been tweeting. Well, we say we knew he'd been tweeting. Tweets from his account. It's always a bit weird with some people because sometimes they can employ staff to tweet on their behalf. But as far as I know, he was tweeting. But only when he was feeling well enough to do so, which wouldn't be all the time. It had been revealed that he'd been on oxygen. So he can't have been alert and able enough to be on hand for as long as you need a Prime Minister to be, particularly, as I say, during an emergency. So what was going on, I thought? Is Johnson calling the shots and somehow bypassing Raab? Are they just telling us that Raab's there to make us feel better? Or was Dominic Raab really in charge and using what we'd laughingly call his initiative in implementing Boris Johnson's general instructions, which wouldn't have been updated since he was hospitalised? Either version's bad. If Raab is just pretending to be at the helm, then that means Johnson was still directly calling the shots, which meant, well, we know he wasn't well enough to take urgent calls at the moment. He's not well enough to take calls at all, you would think. But he wasn't well enough at the time to take urgent calls, of which there must be dozens a day. That would mean that decisions would be delayed until he was strong enough to take the call. He'd been on oxygen. We know that means he can't be sufficiently alert at all times. However, if Dominic Raab really is there to make decisions on behalf of the Prime Minister, and to have meetings, albeit remotely, virtually, then he's doing so without consulting the Prime Minister. That wasn't acceptable at a time when we were told the Prime Minister was able to make decisions. even if Raab weren't a complete cretin. It's not right to have the Prime Minister cut out from decision making when we were being told at the time he was still well enough to make decisions. Now he may not be. The news last night was that he'd been moved. At the time I'm recording this, it's actually right now, but from your point of view, it'd be last night. Hopefully there's no new news overnight, because that would be worrying, that he'd been moved to intensive care. And, and on a personal level, of course, we're hoping he recovers from this. But he's the Prime Minister, and there's a larger duty there. And we need to make sure that in the country, there is someone in charge that has the authority to make decisions when they need to be made in an emergency situation. And what made it particularly worrying for me, the narrative as there was before he was moved to intensive care, was the way in which Boris Johnson has conducted government since becoming Prime Minister. His governance has been characterised by a lack of coordination between cabinet ministers. What should be happening in an emergency situation is cabinet should be regularly meeting, and it doesn't have to be physically close, of course, and these times remotely, video conferencing, whatever system they want to set up, cabinet WhatsApp if that's the best they can do. But we've seen contradictory statements being made by senior ministers about the government's own guidelines, further confusing the issue, which was an indicator that they haven't been discussing them as a group and making sure that they're all on the same page and all sending out the same message. And it was all a deliberate attempt to centralise as much power as possible into Downing Street so that Dominic Cummings actually had control of everything. So now we're in a very worrying situation, because Dominic Raab now is officially deputising. He is acting Prime Minister as far as we can be told. Okay, it doesn't mean to say Boris Johnson is incapable of taking the odd call and making the odd decision in a major situation. But generally speaking, he needs to focus on recovering. He's not fit to be able to work right now. He's in intensive care. He needs rest. He needs to get better. So Dominic Rob has to fully deputise here. But is he? Given that he hadn't been talking to the Prime Minister at a time when he was supposed to be doing that anyway. And, we know that Raab wasn't acting under Boris Johnson's instructions after Boris Johnson went to the hospital, because he hadn't talked to him. They weren't speaking regularly enough. We also know that Boris Johnson couldn't have been doing his normal job from his hospital bed, because neither his fitness, even at the time, let alone now, nor the facilities around that hospital bed would have allowed for it. And it just makes me think, so who is in charge? Have we got Dominic Cummings still pulling some levers here? And are we now literally being ordered about by an unelected bureaucrat? But anyway, I'll just leave you with those thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.